The billionaire had a reputation for being impossible to please. He was always surrounded by the finest things money could buy, from the most expensive cars to the most exclusive events. Yet nothing seemed to satisfy him. Even the wealth he had amassed over the years didn't bring him happiness. He had learned early on that true satisfaction was something that couldn't be bought. On this particular morning, he was heading to his private estate in another city. He had chartered a flight to get there quickly. The plane was one of his favorites, sleek and modern with every luxury imaginable. However, the real reason he had chosen this specific flight was because it would be piloted by someone he had never met before, someone he thought he could impress with his usual arrogance and wealth. As the billionaire boarded the plane, he took in the cabin's luxury. He enjoyed the quiet hum of the aircraft, the soft leather seats and the gleaming wood paneling. But he wasn't here for comfort. He was here to show off. He greeted the flight crew, briefly shaking hands with the young, smiling flight attendants. But his eyes quickly landed on the woman in the cockpit. She was standing at the doorway adjusting her uniform, completely absorbed in her pre-flight checklist. The billionaire studied her for a moment, noting her confidence and the calmness in her demeanor. She was black, something the billionaire noticed but didn't give much thought to. What stood out more to him was that she was a woman, and he had always been skeptical about female pilots. In his mind, flying a plane required a certain level of physical strength and mental sharpness that he thought women might not possess. It wasn't something he'd say out loud, but he'd certainly thought it many times before. The woman glanced up, catching his stare, and smiled politely. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice warm but professional. "Good morning," the billionaire responded, his tone almost dismissive. He didn't expect much from her, just another employee doing their job. But something about her gave him pause. Her poise was unusual and it caught his attention. They exchanged a few more pleasantries, but the billionaire wasn't particularly interested in small talk. He simply wanted to get the flight over with, get to his mansion, and escape the reality that was constantly chasing him. Once everyone was seated and the plane began to taxi down the runway, the billionaire leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, trying to relax. But then he heard the captain's voice crackle over the intercom. "Good morning, everyone. This is your captain speaking. We'll be cruising at an altitude of 30,000 feet, and the weather looks clear for the duration of the flight. I'll keep you updated as we go along." The billionaire's eyes snapped open. The voice was calm, confident, and assured. A far cry from what he'd expected from a woman in charge of such a massive machine. He decided to test her, to see just how good she really was. He didn't like being around people who weren't up to his standards, and he certainly didn't expect a woman to be a skilled pilot. He couldn't resist the urge to undermine her a little. "Hey," he called out, his voice cutting through the calm of the cabin. "Are you sure you know what you're doing? I mean, this plane is worth millions. I'd hate to see something go wrong on my watch." The pilot's eyes didn't falter. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm confident we'll have a smooth flight, sir," she replied, her tone polite but firm. But the billionaire wasn't satisfied with her calm response. He wanted a reaction. He wanted her to prove herself to him, to show him that she was worthy of being in control of a machine like this. A few minutes later, the flight settled into a smooth glide and the billionaire decided to push a little further. "You know," he said, leaning forward slightly, "I've been flying for years. I know a lot about planes, but I've never seen a woman pilot before. How did you get this job?" "I'm curious." The pilot didn't seem offended. She simply smiled again, though her eyes now carried a flicker of something more. "I worked hard for it. Just like anyone else. Hard, huh?" The billionaire chuckled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Well, I guess if you can fly this plane, I'll marry you." It was a throwaway comment meant to belittle her. He wasn't serious, of course, but he knew it would rattle her. He had made that kind of joke before to others, and it always got the reaction he wanted, either a nervous laugh or an uncomfortable silence. He waited, expecting her to flinch, to show some kind of weakness, but the pilot didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at him with a steady gaze. "I'll take that as a challenge, sir," she said, her voice never wavering. The billionaire raised an eyebrow. "A challenge? What do you mean by that?" "You're questioning my skills," she replied calmly. "I don't need to prove anything to you, but if you want to make it a challenge, I'd be happy to show you what I'm capable of." The billionaire was taken aback for a moment. He didn't expect her to respond so boldly. He had thought his mockery would be enough to make her nervous, to make her doubt herself. But here she was, calm and composed, accepting his challenge without hesitation. This was the moment when he realized something was different about her, something he couldn't easily dismiss. She wasn't like the others, and for the first time in a long while, the billionaire felt an inkling of respect. But he quickly pushed that feeling aside. There was no way he was going to admit he was wrong about her. He didn't even consider the fact that he might owe her an apology. No, he just decided to make the rest of the flight as uncomfortable as possible for her, testing her limits. Little did he know, the pilot was just getting started. The plane flew smoothly through the sky, and the billionaire leaned back in his seat, still convinced he had the upper hand. His challenge had been thrown out into the air, and he expected it to either fall flat or make the pilot squirm in discomfort. Instead, he was met with an unexpected calmness from the woman behind the controls. This didn't sit well with him. The more he thought about her response, the more he realized she hadn't even flinched when he mocked her. His words had been sharp, meant to undermine her confidence and test her abilities, but she had answered with a cool, unshaken demeanor, as though she had heard it all before. As the flight continued, the billionaire started to feel a sense of unease. It wasn't the plane or the flight itself that made him uneasy. It was the pilot. There was something about her poise, the way she carried herself, that made him uncomfortable. She wasn't just any woman in a uniform. She was competent, confident, and unbothered by his attempts to belittle her. To distract himself from the growing feeling of discomfort, he turned his attention to the cabin around him. The flight attendants were moving quietly, ensuring passengers had everything they needed. They looked calm and well-trained, just like the pilot. The entire crew, it seemed, was composed and efficient, unlike the chaos the billionaire had expected. He had half anticipated some sort of tension, perhaps an apology from the pilot for his comments or at least an awkward silence. But instead, there was a stillness that almost felt unsettling. The billionaire tried to get a rise out of her again. He had to test her, to see if she would crack under pressure. He couldn't just leave things unresolved, with his pride still hanging in the balance. He leaned forward in his seat, trying to catch the pilot's attention. "Hey, can we speed up a bit?" he asked with a slight smirk. "I'd like to get there faster. You know, the faster we go, the quicker I can get to my vacation." The pilot's voice came through the intercom, her tone as steady as ever. "We are currently cruising at the optimal speed, sir. We'll arrive at the scheduled time." The billionaire frowned. He didn't like being told what to do. He wanted control over every situation, and this flight was no different. But she didn't seem interested in pleasing him. Instead, she was simply doing her job, the job she was clearly more than capable of handling. He took a deep breath and sat back, staring out the window at the clouds below. It was a clear day, the sky a perfect blue with just a few wisps of white. The air was smooth and the hum of the engines was almost soothing. It was a beautiful day, and yet the billionaire couldn't shake the growing sense of frustration. As they continued their flight, the billionaire found himself watching the pilot closely. She sat in the cockpit, calm and collected, her hands steady on the controls. He couldn't help but notice the ease with which she navigated the skies. Every movement she made was precise, deliberate, and confident. Her professionalism was something he hadn't anticipated. He had thought she would be just like the others, easy to put in her place, easily intimidated. But she wasn't. She was in full control, managing the flight with a quiet confidence that made him question everything he thought he knew about her. The more he watched her, the more impressed he became. This wasn't just a woman trying to prove herself in a man's world. No, she was already established in her field, skilled and experienced in ways he hadn't expected. She wasn't trying to prove anything to him. She simply didn't need to. The thought made the billionaire uncomfortable. He had always prided himself on his ability to control situations and people. But this woman wasn't fazed by his wealth or his words. She didn't care about his status. She cared about the job at hand, and she was doing it better than he ever could have. He didn't like the feeling creeping up on him, the realization that he wasn't the one in control. And then it happened. An alarm went off in the cockpit. It was a subtle sound at first, a faint beep that went unnoticed by most of the passengers. But the pilot's reaction was immediate. Her eyes flicked to the control panel, and without hesitation she spoke into the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a small mechanical issue. Please remain seated and stay calm. We are handling the situation. The billionaire's heart skipped a beat. He leaned forward, staring at the cockpit door. He couldn't see what was happening inside, but he could tell from the pilot's voice that it was something serious. The calmness in her tone didn't mask the intensity of the moment. He watched as the flight attendants continued to move through the cabin, their faces professional but alert. There was no panic, no sense of chaos. They seemed completely at ease, as though they knew the pilot had everything under control. For a brief moment, the billionaire considered calling for help, for reassurance, but he quickly dismissed the idea. He wasn't about to admit to anyone on the plane that he was nervous. After all, he was the billionaire, the one who was used to being in charge. The plane jolted slightly and he could feel the tension in the air. But still, the pilot remained steady. She spoke again, her voice firm and composed. "We're experiencing a slight issue with the engine. We're diverting to a nearby airport for a quick inspection. Please remain calm and we'll keep you updated." The billionaire's hands gripped the armrests of his seat. He felt a sense of unease beginning to rise within him. What was happening? How serious was the problem? The plane had a slight tilt and the hum of the engine seemed louder, more pronounced. He could see the flight attendants moving quickly, making sure everyone remained calm. But still there was no panic. And that was when it hit him. The pilot wasn't afraid. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't worried about losing control. She was managing the situation, doing exactly what she needed to do. He could hear her speaking with the ground crew, her voice cool and calm as she provided them with the information they needed to prepare for their emergency landing. It was a language he didn't understand, filled with technical jargon and quick decisions. For a moment he felt small. Here was this woman, handling a situation that could be life-threatening while he was sitting in his seat paralyzed with uncertainty. All the wealth and power in the world couldn't help him here. The plane shifted again and the billionaire glanced around. The flight attendants were still moving about, speaking to passengers in soft tones, reassuring them. Their confidence was rooted in something real, something he didn't have. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. As the plane started its descent, he found himself praying silently that everything would be okay. The woman behind the controls, however, wasn't praying. She was doing what she had been trained to do, and she was doing it better than anyone could have imagined. The plane continued its descent, the engines now roaring with an intensity that made the billionaire grip the armrests tighter. The once serene flight had turned into a tense situation, and he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. He had seen other planes land without a hitch, but this was different. This wasn't a normal landing. The pilot's calm demeanor was one thing, but the fact that they were diverting to another airport meant that something was wrong, something that couldn't be ignored. He glanced over at the flight attendants, who were now seated and buckled in. They were still calm, their faces stoic, as though this was just another day at work. Their tranquility only served to increase his anxiety. He had grown used to seeing people around him in a constant state of unease, especially in situations like this, but these crew members weren't fazed. They trusted the pilot, and that thought made him uneasy. The pilot had spoken so calmly over the intercom earlier. There was no panic in her voice, just a steady confidence that made him wonder, how could she remain so composed? He was doing his best to stay calm, but in truth his thoughts were running wild. What if the situation was worse than they were letting on? What if something went wrong? His mind raced through scenarios, most of them involving the worst-case outcomes. But then he forced himself to breathe deeply, trying to block out the spiraling thoughts. He had to trust the pilot. After all, this was her job. She had done this countless times before, and no matter how much he wanted to believe that his wealth and power gave him control over situations, this was beyond him. This was in her hands. The plane dipped lower into the sky, the ground now visible through the window. He could see the runway ahead, the airport lights twinkling below. They were getting closer. He didn't know where they were exactly, but he could tell it wasn't an airport that he usually flew into. This was a smaller, more rural airport, likely not equipped to handle a luxury jet of this size. But the pilot knew what she was doing. She would get them down safely. The moment of landing came, and the billionaire felt a jolt as the wheels hit the runway. It wasn't as smooth as a normal landing, but it wasn't a rough one either. It was controlled, steady. The pilot knew exactly what she was doing. The plane skidded slightly as it came to a stop, but that was expected in this kind of emergency landing. The billionaire could hear the engines slowing down, the sound of them gradually fading as the plane came to a complete stop. He let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He looked around the cabin. The flight attendants were already moving, checking on passengers, ensuring everyone was secure. There was no sense of chaos, no sense of panic, only professionalism. And the pilot? She was already communicating with ground control, making sure they had the necessary support on the ground to inspect the plane and handle the issue. The billionaire remained seated for a moment, his mind still processing what had just happened. He had been so sure that this flight would be another uneventful, predictable journey. But he had been wrong. This was anything but ordinary. And for the first time in a long while, he found himself reassessing the situation, his feelings towards the pilot shifting from mockery to something closer to admiration. The flight attendants were the first to stand up, and the billionaire followed suit. He slowly made his way to the front of the cabin, stopping by the cockpit door. He had to say something. He couldn't just walk off the plane and pretend like nothing had happened. As he approached the door, the pilot turned and saw him standing there. Her expression was still calm, her face unreadable. She had already removed her headset and was packing up her things, preparing for the next steps. "Everything okay?" the billionaire asked, his voice softer than he expected it to be. She looked up at him, her eyes calm, almost distant. "Yes, we'll be on the ground for a while, but we should be fine." Her response was efficient, but there was a subtle hint of something more in her words. She wasn't seeking praise or acknowledgement. She wasn't interested in impressing him. She had done her job, and now she was focused on making sure everything else would go smoothly. The billionaire hesitated for a moment, trying to find the right words. He had never been in a situation like this before, where his own wealth and influence didn't give him an upper hand. For once he felt like he was out of his depth. I wanted to thank you," he said slowly, "for keeping everyone calm, for getting us here safely." The pilot nodded once, acknowledging his words without fanfare. "It's my job, sir. I'm glad everything's fine." The billionaire stood there for a moment looking at her. He realized something then. This wasn't just about the flight anymore. It was about her. She had remained calm and composed, managing a potentially dangerous situation with ease. She had done what needed to be done, and she had done it better than anyone else could have. For a moment he felt something he hadn't expected, respect, but the feeling was fleeting. He quickly dismissed it, trying to push it aside. He had spent so long cultivating an image of superiority, an image where he was always in control, always the one who called the shots. The pilot's competence, her professionalism, made him uncomfortable. It challenged everything he had always believed about himself. He turned away, nodding at her one last time. "I'll leave you to it then." The pilot didn't respond, her attention already back on the cockpit, communicating with the ground crew. The billionaire stood still for a moment, watching her, before he turned and walked to the exit. The airport was small, almost rural. There were no extravagant terminals, no private luxury lounges like the ones he was used to. The place felt more real, less polished, just like the pilot. Everything about this situation felt raw, unfiltered. It was as if he had been thrown into a reality where money didn't matter, where control didn't matter. Only skill, experience, and the ability to keep calm in the face of adversity mattered. As he stepped off the plane, the cold night air hit him, and he suddenly felt a sense of vulnerability. He was a billionaire, yes, but in this moment he was just another person, someone who had relied on someone else to save him, someone who had underestimated the very person who had kept him alive. He glanced back at the plane, seeing the pilot's figure moving inside the cockpit. She was already in control again, preparing for the next steps. He didn't know if she would ever understand how much her actions had shaken him, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never look at her the same way again. She had proven herself in a way that no amount of wealth or status could. She had taken control of a situation, not because she needed approval, but because it was her job, and she did it better than anyone ever could. The billionaire stood still for a moment longer, realizing that in that short amount of time, everything he thought he knew about power had been upended, and that realization left him wondering if he had finally met someone who was truly untouchable. The billionaire paced around the Small waiting area at the airport, his mind racing. The plane had safely landed, and the pilot had done her job flawlessly, handling a difficult and potentially dangerous situation with ease. But despite the fact that the crisis had passed, something about the encounter lingered in his mind. He had seen her work. He had witnessed her professionalism, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. He was used to being in control, used to holding the power in any situation. He was a billionaire after all. But today, in the sky with that woman at the controls, he had felt small. He had felt helpless, and for the first time in a long while, that feeling had unsettled him. As he sat in the lounge waiting for the plane to be inspected and cleared for departure, his thoughts drifted back to the pilot. The way she had calmly handled the emergency, the way she had never let panic show, had left a lasting impression on him. He had tried to provoke her, to get her to crack under pressure, but she had only grown more resolute. She hadn't just done her job. She had done it better than he ever could have. He couldn't get the image of her out of his mind, the image of someone so composed, so competent, someone who didn't need anyone's validation. She wasn't trying to prove anything to him or to anyone else. She simply was. A small part of him admired her for that, but the larger part of him resented it. He had always been the one to set the terms, to control the narrative. And yet, here was this woman, a pilot, someone who didn't need to prove herself to him or anyone else, standing in stark contrast to everything he had built his life around. He stood up, unable to sit still any longer. He walked over to the window and stared out at the plane. It was parked on the tarmac, the ground crew working around it, inspecting the engines, checking every detail to ensure everything was in proper working order. He knew they would clear the plane soon. They would be on their way, and he could put this whole experience behind him. But something told him that wasn't going to happen. This moment was going to stay with him longer than he expected. He didn't like the feeling of being unsettled. He didn't like feeling as though he had been out of control. He had spent his life building his empire, shaping the world around him to fit his vision. And yet, in the span of a few hours, this woman had upended everything he thought he knew about himself. He couldn't help but wonder how she had gotten to this point. How had she become so confident, so sure of herself? What had driven her to become a pilot in the first place? He knew he had no right to ask those questions, but the curiosity gnawed at him. The sound of footsteps behind him pulled him from his thoughts. He turned around to find the pilot standing there, her uniform neat and her expression calm as ever. "We're cleared for takeoff," she said simply, her tone as professional as it had been throughout the flight. He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips, though he wasn't sure why. "Thanks, you did well back there." The pilot didn't respond with any unnecessary words. She simply nodded, acknowledging his compliment. There was no ego, no need for praise. She had done her job. She had done it well. And now she was moving on to the next step. "I'll be in the cockpit, sir," she said, her tone unchanged. "Please make yourself comfortable. We'll be airborne shortly." As she turned to walk away, the billionaire found himself watching her retreating figure. He didn't know what to make of her. He didn't know whether to be impressed, irritated, or something else entirely. But one thing was certain. He could no longer look at her the way he had before. She had proven herself, and in a way he hadn't expected. She wasn't just a woman in a pilot's uniform. She wasn't just another employee. She was a professional, a master of her craft, someone who could handle anything thrown her way, and he had underestimated her. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the cockpit door closing. He looked around the small lounge, wondering what he should do next. He could always board another flight, continue his journey, and forget about this encounter. But something told him that wouldn't be so easy. He sat back down in the lounge, trying to push the thoughts away, but they lingered. The image of her calm, steady hands on the controls, her unwavering focus during the emergency. It all stayed with him, like a quiet echo that refused to fade. It had been so long since he had encountered someone who didn't care about his wealth, his power, or his status. She had treated him like any other passenger, and in doing so, she had made him feel like just that, an ordinary person. As he stared out the window, the sound of the plane's engines starting up interrupted his thoughts. It was time to leave. The ground crew had finished their checks and the plane was ready for takeoff. He could feel the tension lifting as the plane taxied back onto the runway, the powerful engines vibrating beneath him. He had almost forgotten the feeling of soaring through the sky, of being up above it all. The sense of freedom, of control, had always been something he cherished. But now it felt different. Now, as the plane ascended into the clouds, he couldn't help but think back to the pilot. The woman who had controlled the flight so effortlessly. The one who had shown him what true professionalism looked like. As the plane leveled out, the billionaire turned his attention to the window, watching the world below shrink into a blur of shapes and colors. The flight was smooth now, and everything seemed calm again. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. He had come to terms with the fact that he had been wrong. Wrong about her, wrong about his assumptions, wrong about the way he had treated her. He glanced toward the cockpit, where the pilot was in control, and something in him softened. For the first time in a long while, he realized that there were people in the world who didn't need his approval to succeed. There were people who didn't need his wealth, his status, or his influence. They simply needed their skills, their confidence, and their ability to rise above challenges. The pilot had proved that to him in ways he hadn't expected. And in the process, she had shown him just how much he had taken his own power for granted. The plane continued its journey, the flight stretching on as the billionaire sat in silence, lost in his thoughts. The world outside the window was vast and endless, but he felt smaller now, more aware of the things he had overlooked, the things he had taken for granted. And as much as he hated to admit it, he knew that this flight, this woman, had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. As the hours passed and the plane made its way to its destination, he realized that there was no going back to the way things were before. The pilot had left a mark on him, one that would stay with him long after this journey was over. He had learned something valuable, something he couldn't ignore. True power wasn't about wealth or influence. It was about skill, confidence, and the ability to rise above the challenges life threw at you. The pilot had shown him that. And for the first time in a long time, the billionaire was ready to listen. The billionaire sat quietly as the plane continued its journey. He watched the clouds drift lazily by outside the window, feeling the hum of the engines beneath him. The tension that had gripped him earlier was starting to ease, but he couldn't shake the sense of change that had come over him. It wasn't just the emergency landing or the pilot's calm, steady handling of the situation. It was something deeper. He had always prided himself on being in control, on being the one who held the power in any given situation. But now, for the first time in a long while, he was starting to question what real power even meant. The pilot had shown him something he hadn't seen before. She had handled everything with grace and confidence, never letting panic take over. She had been in charge, not because she wanted to prove herself, but because it was what she was trained to do. She didn't need anyone's approval, and she certainly didn't need to prove anything to him. As the flight continued, the billionaire thought about everything that had happened. The mockery, the challenge, the emergency, it all seemed so trivial now. In the grand scheme of things, it didn't matter who had more money or more power. What mattered was how people responded to the challenges life threw their way. The pilot had responded with competence, with professionalism, with strength, and that was something he couldn't ignore anymore. He glanced over at the cockpit, wondering what the pilot was doing. He had no right to be curious, no right to feel this way, but he couldn't help himself. There was something about her, something that had captivated him in a way he hadn't experienced before. He had never met anyone quite like her. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking on passengers, offering drinks, and making small talk. But the billionaire's mind wasn't on the service or the luxury of the plane. It was on the pilot, the woman who had shown him what true leadership looked like. He couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt, too. He had treated her with disdain, had tried to mock her, to test her. He had assumed she would back down, that she would be intimidated by his wealth and status. But she hadn't. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, she had made him realize just how small his assumptions had been. When the plane finally touched down at their destination, the billionaire felt a mixture of relief and regret. The emergency was over, the flight was safe, and yet, something inside him was unsettled. He knew he would never look at the pilot the same way again. She had proven herself in a way he hadn't expected. And for once, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about success and power. As the passengers disembarked, he made his way toward the exit, but he couldn't shake the thought of the pilot. He had never been the type to seek out apologies or to admit when he was wrong. But today had been different. Today he had seen someone who didn't need to prove anything to him. And in the process, she had shown him a side of himself he hadn't realized existed. He stepped off the plane and into the cool night air, the bustling airport around him. But his thoughts were still on the flight, still on the pilot. He had to speak to her, had to acknowledge what she had done. He couldn't just walk away without saying something. He made his way to the small terminal where the pilot was talking to a few ground crew members. She was reviewing the flight logs, making sure everything was in order before heading out. She looked up as he approached, her expression still calm and professional as if nothing had changed. "Hey," the billionaire said, his voice quieter than usual. "I just wanted to thank you again for today. You really saved the flight." The pilot looked at him, her expression unreadable. But then she nodded once, acknowledging his words. "It's my job, sir. I'm glad everything went smoothly in the end." There it was again, her calm, unwavering confidence. She wasn't looking for praise or recognition. She wasn't seeking anything from him. She was simply doing her job, and she was doing it well. The billionaire found himself standing there, unsure of what to say next. He had spent his whole life building an empire, surrounding himself with people who admired him, who sought his approval. But this woman, this pilot, had shown him something different. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. For a moment, he was at a loss for words. But then something inside him shifted. He couldn't just walk away without acknowledging what she had done, without recognizing her strength, her skill. "I was wrong," he said, the words coming out slower than he expected. "I underestimated you. And I'm sorry for that." The pilot raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by his words. She didn't respond immediately, and the silence stretched on for a moment longer than either of them expected. But then she nodded again, this time with a faint, knowing smile. "It's all right. It happens." The billionaire stood there for a few more seconds, trying to find the right words. He had never been one to admit fault, to apologize. But for some reason this felt different. This felt important. "I just wanted to let you know," he continued, "that what you did today, it changed the way I look at things. It made me realize that there's more to power than money and status. There's real strength in being good at what you do, in being confident without needing to prove anything to anyone." The pilot's smile softened slightly, but she didn't say anything more. She simply gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "I'm glad I could help," she said, and with that she turned back to the ground crew, signaling that her work was done. The billionaire watched her for a moment longer, the weight of the conversation settling in. He had expected her to say more, to engage with him in some way. But instead she had simply accepted his apology and moved on. It was exactly what he needed to hear, because it wasn't about him. It was about her, and in that moment, he understood. He turned away and walked out of the terminal, feeling the cool night air against his skin. The city around him was bustling with life, the lights from the buildings stretching up into the sky. But everything felt different now. He had spent his life chasing power, chasing control, but now, for the first time, he saw things differently. True power, he realized, wasn't about money or influence. It wasn't about owning things or being admired. True power was about confidence, about skill, and about the quiet strength to stand your ground, even when the world tried to knock you down, and the pilot had shown him that. As he made his way to the car that would take him to his next destination, the billionaire felt a sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from winning or succeeding. It was the kind of peace that came from understanding, from realizing that there were people in this world who didn't need validation from anyone, people who knew their worth, who stood tall in the face of challenges, and who handled everything life threw at them with quiet strength. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. And that thought stayed with him long after the plane had taken off again, soaring high above the clouds, taking him to a place that, for once, didn't feel like the end of a journey but the beginning of something new.